Hey guys, I'm doing a little bit of filming here outdoor. Today is the weekend and it's a Saturday, so I'm just gonna get a bit of fresh air. This is the only time where I actually get some fresh air, so exercise a little bit so I have more energy to do new videos for you guys. Today we are going to cover the differences between Old World and New World wines. For those that are new to this channel, I'm Chelsea. I'm an internationally certified wine professional. In this channel, I'll be sharing with you some of the wine tips that I've gained over the years of professional wine training. If you like this video and like to see more videos like this one, do hit like and the subscribe button and join the club. In this video, I'm going to talk about 4 main differences between Old World and New World wines. But before we start the discussion, we should define what is Old World and what is New World. So Old World wine basically covers Europe, countries such as France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Greece, etc. They are the countries that have a long winemaking history. Old World also covers Mediterranean basin, countries such as Lebanon, Israel. They have a long winemaking history as well. Now then we move on to New World. So what is New World? New World covers countries such as the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, South Africa, Japan, China, etc. etc. They are usually countries that do not have such a long winemaking history compared to the Old World countries. As you can see, the countries are pretty diverse. For Old World, there's not just Europe, there's actually countries in the Mediterranean basin that have very different culture. As for New World, the diversity is even greater. We're talking about the US, and then we talk about Australia, and then South Africa, and they all have very different cultures. So it's kind of hard for us to generalize, but we will still try to extract some of the main differences between Old World and New World wines in this video. Now, the first difference that I like to discuss is the winemaking practices. For Old World countries, the practice tend to be more traditional. So traditional practices such as hand harvesting. Part of the reason is because in the Old World countries, there are a lot of steep slopes. For example, Mosel Valley in Germany and Côte-Rôtie in France. These are the regions that are very famous for their steep slopes, and mechanical harvesting would not be possible in these areas. And in some of the other Old World countries, such as Portugal, they do keep some of the fun and traditional wine making practices, such as Douro, Portugal. They still keep the great trading practice in the region. If you visit the region during the harvesting season, you will still see that there are a lot of people doing grape trading, and it's very festive over there. Now, what about New World wines? So for the New World countries, the winemaking practices are usually more modern. They tend to use more technology. For example, the use of stainless steel. In New Zealand, there's a broad use of stainless steel. The country is very famous for its high standards of hygiene that has been transferred from the dairy industry. There are some benefits to using stainless steel versus barrels is that stainless steel containers can have better temperature control compared to the use of barrels. Besides the use of stainless steel, New World country tend to adopt more mechanization. For example, mechanical harvesting was developed by the US, and mechanical pruning is widely used in Australia and New Zealand. Part of the reason is because there's scarcity of labor in some of the rural areas. Now then we move on to the second point, which is regulation. I'm gonna start with Old World again, and I'm gonna use Europe as an example. So in Europe, there's an appellation system. For example, there's AOC in France and there's DOC in Italy. These regulations control what grapes can be planted and where they can be planted, what is the maximum and minimum alcohol level, how the wine is made, for example, how many months do the wine stay in oak barrel, and also some of the other quality control measures such as yields. Basically, in the Old World countries, regulations rule how the wines are being made, and that's because they have a huge focus on terroir. However, there's still some flexibility in the system, such as IGP. A very famous example is Super Tuscan. It is one of the most famous Italian IGP. It is Italy's reputation of excellence. IGP has a more flexible framework on the varieties and the blends. In this case, Super Tuscan main grape varieties in the blends are Sangiovese, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. Now let's compare to the New World regulation. We take the US as an example. There is a system called AVA in the US. This is one of the closest regulation that is comparable to the appellation system in Europe. While this system provides some regulations on the wine producing regions in the US, there's no limitation to the varieties that are planted or the yields. Sometimes there's actually overlapping borders between regions. Since the system is less strict, it provides more flexibility in the winemaking practices. So as we talk about regulations, that brings me to the third point, which is labeling. There's one main difference between Old World and New World labeling. In the Old World countries, we need to remember the names of the regions. We talked about just now that regulations are very important in Old World countries, especially for Europe. Basically, regulations rule how the wines are being made. And hence, what we can understand from that is the region is more important than the grape variety, which is terroir. So in the Old World countries, terroir is the key. Now, terroir is a French word. Basically, it describes the environmental factors in the winemaking region, such as the soil, the topography, the climate, etc., etc. Since terroir is very important, hence the region is very important. If you drink a very good Pinot Noir from Burgundy, you will tend to hear people talk about the region name instead of the grape variety. For example, Pinot Noir from Gevrey-Chambertin, which is a very well-known region for producing Pinot Noir in Burgundy. So usually people will understand Gevrey-Chambertin means Pinot Noir in Burgundy instead of having an additional description of I just drank Pinot Noir from Gevrey-Chambertin. Now another example is Chardonnay. If you drink a very good Chardonnay from Burgundy, you are likely to hear people say, for example, I just drank a Montrachet. So Montrachet is already understood as a Chardonnay from Burgundy, so it is less common for people to hear that I just drank a Chardonnay from Montrachet. So Montrachet and Gevrey-Chambertin, very well-known regions, will have a direct understanding of what is being produced because terroir is very important. Now, this does not only apply to just Burgundy, Bourgogne, it also applies to other French regions such as Bordeaux. And Bordeaux is more common, so it may be easier for general consumers to understand. And when we talk about Bordeaux, we typically associate blends from Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, maybe a small portion of Petit Verdot. As this is so common, we don't realize that actually when we talk about Bordeaux, we actually think about terroir as well, because we immediately associate blends made of grape varieties such as Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, for example. Then of course it does not only apply to France, it also applies to Spain, for example, or Italy. So when you think about Rioja, you think about Tempranillo. When we talk about Chianti in Italy, we think about Sangiovese. So these are the examples of terroir in the Old World countries. Now, New World countries are a lot more straightforward. Basically, most of the time, grape varieties are stated in a bottle. The reason is because when we associate with what we just learned, the regulations are more flexible and there are constantly new winemaking methods that are being introduced. So we cannot assume that people will associate some new winemaking regions to certain grape varieties and terroir, etc. So now you understand the idea of terroir explains the strict regulations in the Old World countries as well as the labeling terms that you can see in the wine bottles. Now the last point that I like to talk about is the tasting profile. So I'm just gonna compare the tasting profile directly between Old World and New World. So let's begin with Old World. The Old World countries tend to have a cooler climate compared to the New World. The New World countries tend to produce riper grapes more consistently than the Old World countries. Therefore, we tend to find higher alcohol level in New World wines compared to the Old World wines. Now, because of the cooler climate in the Old World countries, the Old World countries tend to produce wines with a higher acidity compared to the New World countries. Now, for example, Riesling. The high acidity level is a hallmark of German Riesling, and it has a higher acidity compared to the Riesling that's produced, for example, in Clare Valley in Australia. And as we talk about the flavor profile, New World wines tend to be more fruit-driven. That partially has something to do with the stainless steel, and the wines from the Old World countries tend to have more minerality. So to conclude, it's very hard for us to generalize the wines from the Old World and the New World, but I've tried to narrow down into the four main differences: the winemaking practice, the regulations, the labeling, and also the tasting profile. I hope you have learned something new today, and I'll see you next time. Ciao!